Welcome back to the Working Class History podcast about green bands in Australia in the 1970s. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I'd go back and listen to that first. To begin with today, Meredith Burgmann, co-author of Green Bands Red Union, gives a quick rundown of some of the different types of green bands which builders' labourers implemented between 1970 and 1974.
There were a number of different green bands. There were green bands on natural bush, like in Kelly's Bush. There were green bands to save parkland, and of course the best known of that is the green band on Centennial Park, which is still our huge, iconic park right in the middle of Sydney. It was going to be... The green area was going to be turned into a huge sporting complex with no area left for passive recreation. And it was that green band, the Centennial Park Green Band, that got the huge support of Patrick White, Australia's only Nobel Prize winner for literature. So that, and to see the very austere figure of Patrick White marching in demonstrations in support of the builders' labourers was always a delight. There were a lot of bands on working class areas of Sydney because the labourers were very keen to argue that working class people should still have the right to live in the inner city of Sydney. Of course, this was the period when working class people were being pushed out into the outer suburbs so that the trendy middle class could move into the lovely inner city areas. So a lot of their bands in the Rocks, Glebe and Woolloomooloo, were really about the right of working class people to remain in the inner city. Then there were bands on historic houses. I mean, it's appalling to realise how many beautiful old buildings were going to be torn down by the developers with the support of the Askin government. There was no interest in heritage or even the white history of Australia. There were also community bans on areas that local communities thought were important to the way they interacted with each other. You know, that was to do with public places and, you know, sometimes things like swimming pools. So there were a number of different bands. They were all called green bands because they were put on by the builders' labourers and they were actively defended by the residents and the builders' labourers themselves. One of the bands that I remember really well was the Victoria Street Band. A number of quite well-known activists, including Ann Summers, our feminist icon, were involved in that band. And I had been inveigled into actually even being part of a squatting movement. I'm not a big lover of squatting. I actually enjoy hot showers and things like that. But I'd gone up there one night to stay overnight because we believed there was going to be a raid the next morning. And sure enough, there was a raid in the morning and I was taken away and arrested. Strangely, the guy that arrested me was actually one of my students at Macquarie University. So he was actually very polite to me. And I didn't experience any of the terrible brutality which was sometimes used against the Green Band activists.
Want some jolly squatters camped in Victoria Street. There they lived for months on end. They fought and struggled for their own community, the rights of the tenants to defend. Green bands forever, green bands forever, green bands forever in Victoria Street. We sang as we hopped from chimney top to chimney top. Green bands forever in Victoria Street.
Another band that was very, very strongly defended was down at the Rocks. there's a lovely picture of Jack standing defying the police with a bunch of residents behind him, and there, resplendent in this extraordinary pantsuit, is me straight behind him. And I keep wondering why I was wearing my very best clothes to a demonstration. I think I must have come straight from work, because normally you would not be wearing your very best clothes to a demonstration. I remember another demonstration. It was we were trying to stop the expressway going through Ultimo, and it was at a little street called Fig Street, where we were all sitting down in front of the bulldozers, and an old guy who was actually he was a right wing, one of those old terrible right wing, fairly corrupt leaders of the Labor Party in the Glebe area at the time. He actually came over and spat on me as I was sitting on the ground. So there was a huge amount of opposition to the protesters and to the resident activists. People now have a rosy view of what was going on. As I say, the mainstream media has totally rewritten their history. They now talk about the green bans as if they supported every one of them, and they didn't.
That photo Meredith referred to is included along with lots of others on the webpage for this episode, link in the show notes. In many cases, concessions won by the workers are still around today, like one of my personal favourite buildings, the amazing brutalist block of flats in Sydney called Sirius.
When the ROCs ban was being negotiated, I believe that Jack Mundy had an agreement with Neville Wran, who was to become the Premier some years later in 1976 when the Labor Party won that election. But I think that the Sirius building was, the Sirius building is a lovely, I love it. It's a brutalist building, but it's there. It's large, it's proud, it's got wonderful views over the harbour. Everyone sees it as they go across the harbour bridge. And it was built specifically for social housing. It was built for housing commission tenants to live in the ROCs, where they always had, and enjoy the best views in Australia. That was an agreement that the Builders Labourers came to when they agreed to take off some other bans within the ROCs. So what you have in the ROCs today is all the old historic area is saved, beautiful old terrace houses, some lovely old buildings. It's now the place where tourists in Sydney always go to see old Sydney, and old white Sydney, I need to keep adding. But the Sirius building is also a monument to what the Builders Labourers were about. They were about saving inner city areas for for working class residents of Sydney.
Like many brutalist social housing projects around the world, Sirius was under threat recently, but while all of its tenants ended up being evicted, the building itself has been saved for now. One particularly high-profile ban was on the construction of the Sydney Opera House. While now a world-famous landmark, at the time it was a notoriously disastrous project, and among many errors, the architects forgot to include a car park in the original design. So during the construction, an underground car park was hastily designed, but which would have killed 3 historic olive trees in the adjacent Royal Botanic Gardens. Conservationists complained about the environmental damage, while engineers and architects complained that the car park design didn't include adequate ventilation, but their concerns were completely ignored. So they went to the Builders Labourers Federation, the BLF, who then placed a ban on construction. The developers were incensed by this, at the temerity of lowly construction workers holding up such a high-profile project for 3 measly trees, and all manner of pressure was put to bear on the workers to give in. But they refused, and the Opera House initially just had to open without a car park, and eventually the developers were forced to shell out the extra money and have the car park built in such a way as to not damage any local wildlife. Other bans were implemented as well in defence of different sections of the working class, like Aboriginal people, women and LGBT+ people. There were many Aboriginal members of the Union, but these ideas were also the result of the New Left ideas which permeated the Union, which were shaped by struggles which were going on around the world, like the feminist movement, the burgeoning gay liberation movement, anti-colonial movements, and so on.
Historically, the construction unions generally were under left leadership in most, or in some states, but often the national leadership as well. And historically, those left leaderships had close ties with First Nations leaders and supported many of the campaigns, both within their own states of Australia, but also nationally. So Indigenous Australians were always in and out of construction in every state. And, you know, were always good union members. Some of them went on into leadership. So if I look in say in New South Wales, you had Kevin Cookie. He one of the most amazing men, you know, ever. Like just an Indigenous First Nations worker who had lived through things that no matter how hard a white worker in Australia has lived it, you're never going to match the experience of our Indigenous brothers and sisters. Never. And I guess, again, because of the leadership in the Builders Labourers Federation, I mean, it was something that the left-wing leaders across the Builders Labourers Federation, regardless of their faction, and when I say just regardless of their faction, that might give the impression that that's just about the way they might vote on something. Not true. I mean, these factional differences were, you know, people lived and died by their beliefs, quite literally. So, but despite faction, support of the Indigenous struggle here in Australia for land rights was something that they all agreed on and they all supported, to their credit. Never enough, never will be enough, but to step up and give that support. And in turn, what you get is you get the most amazing working class leaders like Kevin Cook in New South Wales stand up. And Kevin was one of the ones who led the Builders Labourers Federation to the right conclusions about First Nations people, you know, so that you had that massive migrant worker population. You had white Australians who were ignorant of Indigenous history and the history of white invasion. Cookie did the great service to the Australian working class by educating people, and he did it in very practical ways. So, for instance, in the early 70s, you know, they wanted to come in the inner urban area of Sydney, a place called Redfern, and they wanted to demolish a whole area which was known as the Block. It was a whole bunch of houses that were empty and Indigenous people were living there. So Cookie united the Indigenous population, the black population there, and the white working class in the BLF, predominantly white working class, and they placed a ban on the demolition of the Block, and basically an Aboriginal housing cooperative was set up out of that, and again all of the lessons around that, seeing that you know, a cooperative structure, a collectivist cooperative structure, was something that reflected Indigenous culture and life, and so we were taught that, we were shown that in practice, and then that led in years later as we understood more. We come to understand that the First Nations people was a cooperativist, collectivist culture. Didn't have a state as such. There was no separation between the economy and health and welfare and education and spirituality. That you had a civilization that was pre-industrial socialist civilization at work, which is of course why when the white invasion happened, our white forebears had no capacity, no context to understand what they'd run into here, just how amazing it was what they'd run into here, and so all of the historical mistakes and errors and crimes were committed. But it was through people like Kevin Cook and his leadership, Cookie, that we come to understand that in practical ways, because we come to understand it through our own struggle to say, right, that work in Redfern is not going ahead, but we will support this idea of an Aboriginal housing co-op that put in place, healthcare and kindergarten for the kids, etc.
The ban on the block was to stop a developer pulling down a long set of terraces that were traditional Aboriginal residences. Eventually, the Whitlam government, which had just been elected, their great Minister for Urban and Regional Development, Tom Uren, came to the aid of the party, and there was an agreement between the developer who was buying the properties, the federal government, and the builders, labourers, and the local Aboriginal community, that would be Aboriginal community-owned land, and it was for Aboriginal housing. And so that it's often called the first successful land rights claim in Australia, but certainly Aboriginal activists really appreciated that. And towards the end, when the builders' labourers were under so much pressure and were fighting for their existence, the Aboriginal activists were some of the greatest supporters of the builders' labourers.
Another ban which got a lot of attention at the time was in support of a gay student.
At about the same time, a student at Macquarie University, also in Sydney, a student called Jeremy Fisher, had been expelled from his residential college at the university for being homosexual. And the builders' labourers put a ban on the all-new building at Macquarie University until he was readmitted to his college. That was always known as a pink ban. And interestingly enough, that is one of the builders' labourers' actions that has most resonated with students and academics of today. I am continually being asked to comment on that 50 years after the event. But when you think about it, this is when homosexual law reform hadn't happened in Australia. It was still illegal, and yet here was a very working class labourers' union putting a ban on a university until the student got readmitted to his college. They won that. The university put pressure on the college, and the college eventually readmitted the student.
This was one of the more controversial bans amongst the builders' labourers, and a lot of discussion and debates in pubs preceded it.
One of the things that stays with me is the extraordinary discussions and arguments that used to go on in the pubs. Because most of the industry was based in the inner city, it was all these high-rise towers going up. So most of the activists were working in the CBD, so they were emptying out into the pubs around the city when they finished work. So real arguments were going on in the Ship Inn, the Criterion, the Sussex, the Newcastle, just all those pubs around the inner city. And just listening to those arguments and discussions was so interesting. The ban on Macquarie University over Jeremy Fisher was so debated in those pubs. As you can imagine, the rank and file took quite a while to be convinced that this was something that they should put their jobs on the line about. But in the end, the majority did support that ban. So that was very important.
At their peak, there were dozens of bans in New South Wales alone, with others elsewhere around the country.
By 1975, there were 54 green bands, and they were holding up $5 billion of development. That's $5 billion in 1975 terms. So it's like many, many hundreds of billions of dollars now. So it was a huge headache for the state government and the developers. So you can see why such a huge amount of effort was put into destroying the Jack Mundey leadership.
Now, for context, purely in inflationary terms, 5 billion Australian dollars in 1975 is worth a bit under $37 billion today. That's over 26 billion US dollars. But property prices typically go up faster than inflation, so the bans were huge. They led to one newspaper outlet sarcastically making reference to, quote, the Proletarian Town Planning Institute, known in some circles as the Builders Labourers Federation, end quote, with proletarian being another word for working class. This was kind of a joke, but it was also partly true, as for the first time working class people were actually wielding significant influence in the construction of their built environment. Another key issue the builders' labourers took up was the right of women to work in the construction industry. Regular listeners will know that we don't like to devote too much attention to the minutiae of arguments within left-wing political groups, but to understand the divisions within the BLF which emerged, and which would ultimately lead to its downfall, you need to understand the divisions within the Communist Party of Australia.
One of the main problems for the leadership of the builders' labourers at the time was the split within the Communist Party of Australia. The Jack Mundey and Joe Owens were part of the independent Communist Party, sometimes called the Aarons line, from Laurie and Eric Aarons. What had happened was that in 1961, there'd been the split with the Maoists, which happened really all around the world, and the Communist Party, Marxist-Leninists, the Maoists, became a separate party. Not much happened in Sydney. There were a couple of Maoists, but the leadership of the CPA-ML were all in Melbourne under Ted Hill and, of course, Norm Gallagher, the Federal Secretary of the Builders' Labourers. The next split, which I think was probably even more damaging, occurred after the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Soviets. The so-called Stalinists, those who still supported the Moscow line, began to split away from the Communist Party. And the problem with that was that one of the leaders of that split was Pat Clancy, who was the secretary of the Tradesmen's Union, the BWIU. So what you had was the split within the Communist Party, the three-way split within the Communist Party was most played out in the building industry, because there was the secretary of the Federal Builders' Labourers down in Victoria being with the Maoists, the secretary of the Tradesmen's Union, the BWIU, being with the Stalinists, and the secretary of the BLF in New South Wales being prominent in the independent CPA, the Aarons line CPA. So that was a huge problem all the way through. Every split and every little difficulty within the building unions was exacerbated by that split in the Communist Party.
The different factions and acronyms can be a bit confusing, so we will just try to summarise again. The Communist Party of Australia of 1960 ended up splitting into three rival factions. The first split happened in 1961, which was a reflection of the Sino-Soviet split. Essentially, strategic geopolitical differences between the Soviet Union and China under Mao Zedong. This split communist parties around the world, and in Australia it resulted in the creation of the CPA (Marxist-Leninist), which supported Maoist China. We'll refer to them as the Maoists, and they included Norm Gallagher, who has been mentioned several times, who was based in Melbourne, and was the secretary of the National Builders Labourers Federation. As Meredith explained, after the 1968 Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, which at the time was trying to ease up on some civil liberties, the majority of the CPA totally opposed the invasion. So those who supported Moscow, typically referred to as Stalinists, even though Joseph Stalin had died by that point, left the party and set up a new one called the Socialist Party of Australia, SPA. Pat Clancy, the secretary of the Building Workers Industrial Union, who we mentioned in part 1, was a member of the SPA. So the bulk of the CPA which remained was in the Aaron's faction, who were strongly influenced by New Left ideas. Ideas like individual freedom, democratic rights, feminism, gay liberation, black liberation, and so on. The bulk of the central leadership of the New South Wales BLF, including Jack Mundy, were part of this CPA, alongside some Labour Party members and the odd anarchist. This said, it's worth stressing that only up to around 100 members of the New South Wales BLF were actually members of the CPA, about 1% of their total membership, but their influence stretched much further. These divisions would have a big impact on the more progressive campaigns the BLF wanted to run, those which weren't just about paying conditions, or which were in support of specific sections of the working class, like women.
Again, New South Wales led the country in my view on this, because at a policy level they supported women in construction, and I don't mean they just had a policy that they wanted to see more women in construction. I mean they worked women in. So the blokes would just like if you had a blacklisted male worker, if the employer wouldn't pick these workers up, well, the union would bring them into the job. Our union would do it and work them alongside everybody else. And if the employer didn't pay, well, then there'd be bans placed. And a mate of mine, Sandra Zerbo, she tried to work here in Victoria, but again, the leadership here in Victoria was less progressive on this issue. And the secretary, Norm Gallagher, wasn't like Jack Mundy. Norm, had an outdated view of women and their rights and the roles that they were capable of playing, etc. So he was determined that women wouldn't come into the industry, despite him being a communist. He was very conservative on that issue. So in New South Wales, they took that very seriously, and they did. I suppose what came to be known later as affirmative action. Yeah, you're seeing the beginnings of that in the practice of the BLF in New South Wales, where and it was based upon an absolute and utter understanding that these women were our sisters, just as much as the bloke was our brother. And you couldn't just be right about that. You had to be right about it and win. Just like everything else, you could be right about Vietnam and say the war shouldn't happen. But unless you went out and put your body on the line and you helped the Vietnamese win, it wasn't much good. Unless you went out onto those fields and you stopped the rugby games of the white South African teams that come out here, then you'd be right because you opposed apartheid in your own lounge room, but you did nothing to help them win. And people say, well, what gives you the democratic right to do that, to force an employer to hire a woman that he doesn't want to hire? Well, I guess our union leaders, to their eternal credit, reversed the question and said that we are the majority in the workplace. And it's time that small minority of people were put in some perspective. Yes, they could have a say, but only a say, like everyone else.
Another one of the problems that the leadership of the BLF in New South Wales had was that their policies on what we would now call more sort of identity politics were really opposed by the Stalinists. The Stalinists set themselves up as a separate party called the SPA, the Socialist Party of Australia, and they opposed the New South Wales BLF support for women in the industry. That was considered left-wing adventurism. They very much opposed support for the gay and lesbian movement, and they kept arguing that the New South Wales BLF had become captive to middle-class, students and trendies. What, in fact, the New South Wales builders labourers were doing was really quite groundbreaking. Jack had already started arguing about the social responsibility of labour, where he was saying that labourers have to think about what they do with their own labour, and that was really how the environmentalism and the green bands really start in the builders labourers. But he was also saying that they have to be part of a new society, and that included support for women. One of the bands that the old Stalinists in the BWIU were most opposed to was women academics and students came to the builders labourers and asked for a ban to be put on Sydney University until it allowed a women's studies course at the university. There'd been this big campaign to have a women's studies course, but it wasn't until the builders labourers put a ban on all new building at Sydney University that the women's studies course was permitted.
There ended up being 60 to 80 women working in the construction industry in New South Wales. Not a big number, but this was up from zero. And there was still sexism on building sites, which women workers fought against. In later interviews with Meredith, some women workers also reported that they also got swept up in the general macho culture. But still, this was an advance on many parts of the world, like the UK, where construction was still an entirely male industry, and construction unions were still using scantily clad women as pin-ups in union publications.
This support of the groups such as the LGBTIQ community and the women, and what was seen as middle-class types, students, etc., was always poo-pooed by the Maoist leadership in Victoria. Norm Gallagher always said that the BLF leadership was kowtowing to Sheilas and Puftas, and he had no empathy at all for groups other than what he saw as, the genuine working class, i.e. the people who supported him in Victoria. Certainly the builders labourers were ahead of their time in seeing that there could be this coalition of interests. Jack Mundey always referred to the enlightened working class and the enlightened middle class coming together to fight for a better society. And Norm Gallagher would have none of that. Also, the BWIU leadership under Pat Clancy was always arguing that what the BLF leadership were doing was left adventurism, that it was pandering to middle class views of society and not sticking to what the working class should have been doing, which was wages and conditions. So the very radical actions of the BLF were being attacked from both sides, both from the Stalinists and from the Maoists.
Sheila is Australian slang for woman. For context, it's probably also worth pointing out that in the early 1970s, most groups which called themselves Marxist-Leninist or Maoist shared the homophobic ideas of mainstream society, although sometimes this was dressed up in radical left-wing language, like describing it as petit bourgeois, decadent, or what have you. At the same time, it's also worth pointing out that especially after organising work by the Gay Liberation Front, which we talk about in episodes 24 and 25, some people who came from this tradition, like Huey P. Newton, co-founder of the Black Panthers, came to forcibly reject these sort of homophobic views. Going back to the BLF, both it and the wider union movement were divided. Leaderships of most other unions were also terrified of the structural reforms of the New South Wales BLF, introducing limited tenure and requiring that all union officials be from the workforce. This was a genuine existential threat to the whole union bureaucracy. With that background, and with billions of dollars at stake, the capitalist establishment, the courts, the police, and the media became increasingly desperate to put an end to the green bans.
Legal threats were made constantly. The union would just say, "Do your worst. Do your worst. We'll cop your hardest. Just throw your best shot, and see what happens when you do it." Outside of that, many of the employers used the traditional approach, which still goes on today, of hiring thugs and criminals. They'd get bouncers and from the strip joints and the nightclubs around town and try to heavy people, put them on jobs as scabs. That's happened since I was a boy, and it continues to happen now. Stand over people. And so that was tried, but it wasn't that in the end that destroyed us. In the end, it was our own internal divisions.
The builders' labourers, by the end of their period, say about 1975, were almost totally alone, with the forces against them just being so huge. First of all, the media was totally opposed to them. The Sydney Morning Herald now argues that, they've totally rewritten history. They seem to claim that they supported the green bans. Well, they didn't. They produced five editorials in 12 days calling for Jack and Joe and Bob to be jailed. So none of the mainstream media supported the builders' labourers. The state government, of course, was absolutely hostile. The police were used over and over again to protect employers' interests. The union movement was opposed to what the BLF was doing.
Jack Mundy, Joe Owens and Bob Pringle are the BLF leaders being referred to here. Even though they were originally illegal almost everywhere, in most countries today trade unions are legal and given various rights to operate, as long as they play by the rules set by capitalist governments. But the BLF wasn't prepared to play by those rules.
I mean, you join a union mostly and it was like an insurance company, and at best it was a good insurance company. Basically, your wages and conditions would be protected. Safety would be addressed, so you went home in the same condition you arrived in the morning. But to join a union that had a leadership that was concerned about a better world, not just a bigger share of this one, that was, especially for a kid like me and the others like me who became my mates and my comrades, it was life-changing. And when we look back at the green bans, and we look back now, what we see is, as I said at the outset, you see workers taking the decisions about where we work and where we live, and demanding that through our use of industrial power. And of course, that's why the union had to go. That's why it had to be smashed, because it was challenging capitalism.
The employers and the state, though, were unable to break the green bans on their own. To finally achieve that, they needed the rest of the union movement, as well as the Federal Builders Labourers Federation under Norm Gallagher and his Maoist faction. The BLF had already fallen out with the tradesmen's union, the BWIU, run by the Stalinists, following the successful margin strike which reduced the pay differential between skilled tradesmen and so-called unskilled labourers. Then, the New South Wales BLF was expelled from the local trades council, supposedly for violence during a meeting, but those actually involved in the violence were members of the Maoist faction, not the local leadership. In late 1973, the employers locked out the New South Wales BLF for several weeks, denouncing them as, quote, communists, who were trying to, quote, create anarchy. Various bosses tried to bribe Jack Mundy with millions of dollars to call off the bans. One developer offered him $20 million just to partially call off one ban, but he refused to be bought. And in any case, because the bans all had to be voted for and enforced by an organised and engaged rank and file, it's unlikely he would have been able to call them off in any case. So the master builders, referred to as the master bastards by a lot of rank and file workers, tried to deal the New South Wales BLF a fatal blow by deregistering the union. But behind the scenes, they'd made a deal with Federal BLF Secretary Norm Gallagher that if the New South Wales leadership were all expelled and control taken by the Maoist federal leadership and the green bans largely ended, then the union would be re-registered. After the union was deregistered, Norm Gallagher and the federal leadership used various unlawful and underhand tactics to kick the New South Wales leadership out of the union. They also essentially set up a rival union structure in New South Wales, sending in organisers to recruit workers to the federal BLF as opposed to the local branch. At the beginning, this didn't have a lot of success, with the federal union picking up only about 1,000 members, compared with 7,000 who rejoined the local branch. Some workers in other unions did try to support the New South Wales branch. For example, the smaller construction union called FEDFA refused to work with members of the federal BLF. So when some of their crane driver members went on strike over pay cuts, the federal BLF flew in scabs from Victoria to break the strike. And after 6 weeks, FEDFA had to relent and agree to work with federal BLF members. Federal BLF organisers were usually expelled from job sites by labourers with physical force. But there were some amusing other altercations. For example, when one Maoist student went to lecture a group of labourers on one building site against their ultra-left adventurism, rather than remove him from the premises, they nail-gunned his briefcase to the ground. The employers, the Master Builders Association, worked with the federal union throughout this whole process, giving pay increases only to ticket holders of the federal union and not to the New South Wales branch. A mass meeting took place of 1,500 builders labourers, which unanimously voted to reject the Maoist takeover, but Gallagher ignored the result and declared that the meeting had been stacked with, quote, residents and P-words, with P-word being a repeat of the homophobic slur previously quoted by Meredith. After having essentially suspended union democracy, Gallagher was eventually forced to call union elections. His faction then just ruled every candidate outside their faction invalid and declared a, quote, bone-crushing victory in the uncontested elections. This was later ruled completely illegal by the courts, but the Green Band faction didn't want to get their union comrades put in jail for contempt of court. Some other unions, like the Australian Workers' Union, also provided scabs to break BLF green bans, bulldozing homes in Ultimo, for example, to build an expressway. A crucial factor in weakening the New South Wales BLF was the decline in the construction boom, and although they'd been abandoned by much of the union movement, they found support from many other places, particularly from residents groups, LGBT+ rights groups, Aboriginal communities, who all organised mass protests alongside builders labourers to help defend the bans. But this wasn't enough to save the green bans. On the 12th of March 1975, Norm Gallagher and the NBA agreed that employers would only employ ticket holders of the federal BLF, and that New South Wales BLF members would be sacked. With unemployment going up, this was a very powerful threat. Then, 5 days later, the New South Wales branch office was broken into, and all of their membership files were stolen. The perpetrators of the robbery were never caught, but the only people who would have benefited from it would be the federal BLF leadership. This effectively meant that the New South Wales branch could no longer function. A week after that, the New South Wales union leadership, which no longer technically included Jack Mundy, as he'd served his 2 terms and returned to work as a builders labourer, called their final stop work meeting.
When the BLF leadership eventually called their last meeting and the union went out of existence, there were only 2 unions in support of them at that stage. It was a very emotional meeting. There were 3,000 builders labourers sort of in tears, and the only 2 unions there were the FEDFA, the very small building union that had always been in support of the builders labourers, and their leadership under Jack Camborne, who was also in the Communist Party, was very important. The FEDFA was there and the Teachers Federation was there in support of the builders labourers. But the other unions were totally opposed because they saw the sorts of policies that Jack had brought in, particularly limited tenure of office and the lowering of union officials' wages, as very dangerous to them.
In capitalist society, workers' unions are tied to the interests of the national capitalist economy in many ways. So unions at big companies may fight their employers, but at the same time they need their employers to remain profitable in order to continue operating. And across the whole country, unions need a growing economy in order to be able to provide jobs for their members. So conventional trade unionism in wealthy democracies normally operates within these boundaries, Unions will typically try to bargain for a slightly larger slice of the pie using, quote, reasonable methods, and in return, employers and governments tolerate them within a strict legal framework. So when workers try to go too far by demanding pay or conditions too good for the capitalist economy to bear, or demanding control over the production process itself, which happened in many places in the late 60s to early 70s, like the UK, Italy, France and the US, the unions turned against the workers, ordering wildcat strikes to end, expelling and having militants fired and so on. Even left-wing union officials in this situation typically acted in the same way as those on the right, although they'd normally give the justification that they had to rein in a particular group of workers in order to protect the union as a whole for the longer term. But the leaders of the New South Wales Builders Labourers Federation never did that. They never compromised their ideals. They argued that if they'd called off the green bans in order to remain in control of the union, then the union was effectively dead anyway. So instead they decided to step aside and argued for rank and file workers to continue the struggle for green bans and workers' control over the production process inside the new BLF.
I also remember the last meeting, as I say, where 3,000 builders labourers in the lower town hall just sat there, some of them weeping, as Jack and Joe and Bob said, this is the end of the line for us, thank you for your support. Go into the, to keep your jobs, go into the Gallagher-led federal union and continue the fight from there. It was just so sad.
Some people might think this was a mistake, that they would have been better off retaining power. But others would question what's the point of nominal power if you can't stay true to your ideals. In many ways, this really is the centre of many debates within the left and the wider working class movement, particularly between statist and anti-statist wings. And of course, we don't have all the answers, but one thing is clear, that the New South Wales BLF didn't deteriorate like many unions around the world from that time, from internal forces of bureaucratisation, but it was only destroyed from without. As it happens, many of the officials of other unions who abandoned the BLF eventually came to regret their actions many years later.
It wasn't until Joe Owen's funeral about 5 or 6 years ago that the then Secretary of Unions New South Wales, which is the new name for the old Trades and Labour Council, the Secretary, Mark Lennon, actually apologised to the old builders labourers present on behalf of the union movement for the fact that the other unions had not supported the BLF leadership against the Gallagher onslaught. The reason why people are very backward now about talking about the Gallagher intervention, and this of course was the main reason that the builders labourers went out of existence. The Gallagher intervention, the federal intervention into a state union, and these sorts of things happen from time to time in unions. And the other New South Wales unions, on the whole, stood back and let Gallagher intervene. If the Tradesmen's Union, the BWIU, had agreed to protect builders' labourers' work, that federal intervention would not have been successful. The reason why unions today feel a bit shamefaced about what they did was because not only did the Royal Commission reveal that Gallagher was taking money from the bosses in order to undertake that intervention, the master builders actually just admitted in court that they had bankrolled the intervention into New South Wales. I always get cranky about that because I spent about 2 months of my life going through all the accounts and proving that Gallagher had been taking money from the bosses. But also Gallagher himself was personally benefiting from money and services given to him by various bosses. Everyone knows the story of his beachfront house being built by one of the bosses. So it was the Gallagher intervention that was the main problem for the builders' labourers. But as I say, the media, the state government, the police, Most politicians were opposed, although interestingly enough, I think it was 54 Labor politicians signed a letter in support of the builders' labourers. They were mainly left-wing Labor politicians, but there were also quite a number of right-wing Labor politicians. And of course, what the builders' labourers had on their side was the absolutely undying support of the resident action groups and those groups that they had supported, such as the gay community, the gay and lesbian community, and the women activists, and of course the students. But that wasn't enough to defeat the forces of the state.
With the federal BLF in charge, most of the green bans were ended, and women workers, who were disproportionately active militants, were once again banned from the industry. And ultimately, while the employers and the state were happy to use the federal BLF for their own ends, after the militant self-organisation and direct action faction in New South Wales was completely defeated, they had no use for the federal BLF anymore.
So in 1974, when the employers and the government deregistered us for the first time, because in the 1980s it was on for like a real dereg and derecognition. We were outlawed then. But in 1974, we deregistered, and the deal was put to the General Secretary, Norm Gallagher, that re-registration could happen, but it couldn't happen with the New South Wales leadership. And Normie took the deal. And the rest, as they say, is history. Because, of course, around about 9-10 years later, we were all deregistered. And you know, that's when they really did mean it. There was a permanent police squad working on the BLF 24/7. When they raided our office, the legislation governing the raid, which raid took everything from the office, PowerPoints, everything. The legislation governing the raid didn't go through the parliament till 12 hours after the raid happened. And when they were asked, well, how come you did that? They said, well, if we had to put the legislation through, we would have forewarned the BLF and would never have got into the building. And I mean, they were very, like Australians hadn't seen this before, where you had a group that was, I mean, we couldn't even get a paid ad in the newspapers, you know. And so the people who'd been blueing like cut cat, those of us who'd been fighting each other with real tenacity in the 70s, were now on, many of us were on the same side. Because for us, who'd opposed our General Secretary destroying the New South Wales BLF, we saw the same thing happening, and we warned about it in the 70s. We said, this will come back and bite us on the bum. This will affect our whole movement. Don't do this. We were ignored then. And around 10 years later, of course, it happened. And the same thing that happened in the New South Wales BLF happened to us virtually nationally. So, you know, we can never mistake the factional life of the movement for the real world. We can never let the ideas we have in our head attain more importance than the rights and the democratic control and power of our members. So, you know, that our movement here in Australia, I know because I lived through it, let alone knowing the history. I actually lived through it. I can tell you, we've never got over what happened then. Even the younger ones who now lead the movement, who know nothing about these events in the 70s or the 80s, or very little, don't know the extent to which they suffer under the mistakes we made.
When the state did finally come for the BLF, they no longer had the widespread support they earlier enjoyed from Aboriginal communities, residents groups and others. So that was the definitive end of the Builders Labourers Federation. But in the first half of the 1970s, they showed all of us how we can organise a movement, how we can win, both direct improvements for ourselves at work and how we can stand up for particularly oppressed parts of our class, how we can support Indigenous struggles, how we can take more control of our life's activity, our labour power, and defend our environment, which is now more pressing than ever.
So that was a really important process to be a part of, to see unity around the role we played as working people, as the ones who created work and culture and time, weekends, time and space. We created all that. It was never the employer. And we took that right. And the extent to which, you hold on to rights is the extent to which you continue to fight for them. So with the introduction of neoliberalism, unfortunately, some of those rights were not continued to be fought for, and we have, at least temporarily, lost them.
As we often hear, taking part in these struggles was often a joyful, life-changing experience for those involved as well.
The builders' labourers were so proud of the fact that, they had been responsible for these green bans, and that Kelly's Bush was probably the best known green ban of them all, that 2 old builders' labourers, when they died, asked to have their ashes scattered, illegally I might add, in Kelly's Bush, and that's exactly what we did. We went down to Kelly's Bush after the funeral and scattered their ashes.
That's all the time we have for these main episodes. If you'd like to hear more from Dave Kerin about his experiences and his activities today with the Earthworker Collective, we've produced a bonus episode for our Patreon supporters. Our podcast is only possible thanks to support from you, our listeners, on Patreon. In return, you get access to exclusive content like this, as well as early access to all podcast episodes, discounted books and merch, and more. Learn more and sign up at patreon.com/workingclasshistory, link in the show notes. We think the story of the green bans is so important, and there's loads of information we weren't able to fit into these episodes, not least because sadly so many of the participants have died. But Meredith interviewed dozens of workers for her and her sister's book, Green Bans Red Union, so we highly recommend getting hold of a copy if you can. Link in the show notes. Intro music to part 2 was The Green Band Fusiliers by Dennis Kevins. Also featured was Green Bands Forever by Mick Fowler and the jazz band called Green Band. We're going to end this episode with an extract of the song Monuments by Dennis Kevins, performed by Bob Fagan, which was first published in the New South Wales BLF Journal in 1970. All courtesy of unionsong.com. Thanks to all of our patrons for enabling us to spend time making this podcast, and thanks to you for listening. Catch you next time.
I see your monuments displayed in smog-polluted air, to the wraiths of black-shoaled mountains in the wake of I don't care, in oil-choked harbours, upturned fish and nuclear-sullied seas, in forests felled and deserts made from songbirds' aviaries. You've had your chance, you've run the world your way, we know it's true. Your monuments stick in my craw, the monuments to you. We leave the cities of the world, cemented with our sweat, the cemeteries of our youthful years, but we're not beaten yet. For there's a living monument to all we've lived and learned, the green bands we've created and the victories we have earned. And one day when our cities are but dust upon the air, the pollen from our fighting hearts will bloom again somewhere. And one day when our cities are but dust upon the air, the pollen from our fighting hearts will bloom again somewhere.